It's August, which means it is Classics Month. I did this last year and I had a lot of fun, so I figured I'd bring it back, and I tried to keep it going after August, and I was, fairly successful, but I think once we ran into the fall, I kind of ran out of steam. So, for those of you that don't know, Classics Month is where I look at classic records from the progressive rock landscape. These could be records that have, are from the 70s and 60s or 80s, but I'm going to start including some more modern classics in here as well. Anything from, like, basically that haven't been released within, we'll say, like the past 5 or 6 years, because I want the dust to settle. I want the fermentation process to have at least begun. The other thing that's different than my usual reviews is that I won't be rating any of these albums. I mean, they're classics. They're classic for a reason. The lowest rank that I think I could give any of these records is an I love it with my whole heart. Most of them are masterpieces, so I don't think I'll be rating any of these. These are just a fun kind of spotlight on records that I really loved and either helped shape my musical identity or ones that really did something for the landscape of music. So anyway, I wanted to start this Classics Month off with an album that I've been requested time and time and time again, and it's one that was a massive influence on my musical tastes. So without further ado, let's just dive into it. Crime of the Century by Supertramp. So Supertramp is a UK group. I think they, if legend holds, I believe they were financed by some kind of philanthropic entrepreneur that basically just gave the record studio a bunch of money to finance a band. The first two records of them, their self-titled record and Indubitably Stamped, were oh boy. But it wasn't until their 1974, their third album with the solidified classic lineup, where we have Rick Davies, Roger Hodgkins, I always mispronounce his last name, Hodgson. I'm going to get ripped apart, as I always do whenever I'm talking about Roger. But what really solidifies this, we had Dougie Thompson that came in between Indubitably Stamped and Crime of the Century. But Bob Sengenberg on drums and percussion, and John Helliwell on saxophone, clarinet, keyboards, and backing vocals. And I think it's really John's presence here that was that super glue. It was the essence that tied everybody together. Because even though Rick and Roger were doing a really good job of playing off one another to really kind of solidify the band up into this time, I think it really was John that was that special sauce that we really needed. I've already covered the rest of the Supertramp discography, which you can find up here for a worst to best. We're talking specifically about Crime of the Century and what makes it so special. As with most of the Supertramp albums kind of moving forward until Famous Last Words in 1982, half the tracks are written by Rick, the other half are written by Roger, with a little bit of carryover between the two. But listening to this album and most of the albums moving forward within the Supertramp discography, you can definitely tell like which tracks are a Roger track and which tracks are a Rick track. The album opens off with the Roger track of School, and it's that blaring harmonica that just lays down the road work for the rest of this album. And this, like, shouting out into the darkness void really is the moniker of this album. All the tracks on here have this kind of darkness to it that no other Supertramp album has. The front cover shows like these hands reaching out of these bars, almost like a Superman 2 floating disc that gets rotated where, this person's imprisoned, they're floating out through space. That essence, that visualization is really found throughout a lot of these tracks, because as I mentioned, a lot of these tracks are very dark, either in subject matter or just in tone of the tracks and the music that's found within it. I already mentioned School, and School, again, has Roger on the keyboards. It's very, like, fluid, and that's something that I really love about Roger's playing style. He's a very like fluid player. It's very like almost as though he's playing a stringed instrument in that case. It's flowing from one note to another note seamlessly in that case. And I love that keyboard solo that we have at the end of this track that leads to the big crescendo that has this big payoff by the end. I mean, this track flies by at 5.5 minutes and it feels so contained. It feels so solid. And this single track opens up the album perfectly because it's so tight, it's so consistent, it says exactly what it wants to do, and it's also at the peak, the pinnacle of progressive rock in 1974. Like, this album really is the perfect example, the most successful crossover prog record I think we've ever had, because it doesn't follow the same conventional styles of the usual pop track or the rock track that we would have at that time. We have harmonicas, we have clarinets, we have saxophones, but it falls much more in kind of like a jazz style of playing, all really encaptured within a really tight and contained rock formula. And no other album really was this successful at doing it. We had other contenders that I would say for sure, but I think this one is the most successful. Going from school, we get Rick's first track of Bloody Well Right, and I've mentioned how I love Roger's playing style as being very fluid. Rick is much more of using the piano as a percussive instrument. His is much more of a brass kind of a styling of using the piano. If Rick is more of a strings kind of an instrument, Rick is much more of a brass, where it's much more abrasive. It's a lot more of this bum, and he basically uses the piano as a percussive, as I've already mentioned. So everything is keeping time. Everything is like it's like a clap of the track, and Bloody Well Right has that. I love the call. I love that right, quite right. You bloody well right. It's very infectious. It's very fun. It's very boppin' in that sense, and it serves as a foil to a lot of Roger's tracks that kind of sandwich it, because right after that we have Hide in Your Shell. And Hide in Your Shell was basically my theme song when I was in high school. I mean, I grew up with this album, but I just fell in love with this album and listened to this album in repeats, starting basically at the end of middle school, at the beginning of high school, and Hide in Your Shell really was my theme song. I would listen to it, I would doodle lyrics within my notebooks, I would draw pictures that have all this, and it's really the perfect encapture within, just under 7 minutes of what so many other tracks try to do with this type of subject matter. It's talking about being very hesitant and cautious about the world that's around you, and using this barrier of hiding within your shell to help protect you. But it's also kind of flirting a little bit with the idea of when this no longer serves you and the drawbacks to doing that. But at the moment, when you're in the moment, all you can do is just nope, you're hiding away. You don't want to be even stimulated in that. Everything is way too much. You're just going to hide in your shell. It's the emotional crescendo at the end of this track that always gets me. It always makes me feel so emotional. I nearly weep during this track half the time, that I just like, oh my gosh. Roger has distilled a quintessential human emotion that I cannot just get away from. And then from there, we go into a Rick song of Asylum that is just as much, if not more so impactful, because it's basically telling you this is what happens when you lose touch with reality. This is what happens when you hide away in your shell for far too long and you have completely lost touch with those around you. Hiding in your shell might be a good defense mechanism, but it shouldn't be your only mechanism. You need to get out there. You need to talk with other people so that you don't essentially just go insane. And Asylum is really that whole don't call me crazy. I'm not crazy. This is real. Nobody's listening to me. And the amount of emotion that Rick plays into this is just heart-wrenching. That's the first half of the album. Second half of the album starts off with Dreamer, one of the biggest Supertramp singles. I don't know anybody that doesn't know this track at this point. I remember this track being played so often in my high school. We had a jukebox that was in our cafeteria, and it was like $1 for 3 songs. And we would constantly play this song in Seven Nation Army over and over again, to the point where I basically lost my taste for this track just because of how often it was played. This track, along with Bloody Well Right, are really the two outliers of being the fun, bumpin', very happy tracks. But even with both of those, you know, Dreamer really is this whole kind of concept of like, hey, you can dream all you want, but it's not reality. You know, you can't put your hands in your head. You know, you gotta live in the reality that we have. We then go into Rudy, the longest track on the album at 20 minutes. I wish 7 minutes and 20 seconds. And this is just a brilliant song, all about Rudy, the football player. Love how driven this track is. I love that mid-piece jam session that would be really like, this was basically the groundwork for Brother Where You Bound, their 80s album, the album that was put out once Roger left. I love how big this track is. I love how both Roger and Rick are playing with one another when it comes to that jam session. This one really like knocks it out of the park. It's the best rockin' track off of the album. And man, it just wants you to get up and go. Then we come into a very heartfelt track of If Everyone Was Listening. And this track just, it makes me weep every chance it gets. You know, it's all about what would happen if everybody is listening. This clown that's always trying to get attention but never can. And again, we keep kind of revolving around this darker concept within this album, which is this need for attention, this need for approval, this need for validation, and not really quite getting it. And so it's like, okay, well, what if everybody was listening? What would you say if everybody was listening? Would you say something clever? Would you say something funny? Would you say something moving? Like, what would you say? And then kind of dealing with the fallout of, what do you plead, you actor indeed? Would you just be trying to spout out somebody else's words, or would you try to find your own voice? Then we come to the closing track, the title track of Crime of the Century. And this was the track that really helped pave the way for my love of progressive rock. You know, this was like little baby notes when they were like yay high, really getting into the concepts and the ideas of progressive rock and what it meant to be progressive rock. Because the first minute or two of this track really is just the build up, the little appetizer, which is just saying, hey, we are now starting to put on trial those who have committed the crime of the century. Let's take off their masks. That can't be right. That's me. That's us. That's all of us. We have committed the crime of the century. And it never really comes out what the crime of the century was. It's just that we are all complicit in it. We've all done our own tasks to perpetrate it. And the rest of the track really is this massive buildup that keeps building and building and building. And it's the perfect ending because, much like, say, a Stephen Hackett's Shadow of the Hierophant or a Yes's Starship Trooper, where it really has this very simplistic root, this very simplistic starting point that just keeps getting added to and added to and added to and added to. And it just continues to build until it's this massive monster that essentially crumbles upon the weight that it's been built on. And I friggin' love it. It's the perfect ending to a perfect album. It really is. At the end of the day, what can I say about Crime of the Century that hasn't already been said? This was the one that put Supertramp on the map. After this, they would go on to do Crisis What Crisis, Even in the Quietest Moments, and Breakfast in America. I consider this their best album, but each album that they put out still has those standout moments that I love from Supertramp. Yeah, this is one of my all-time favorite records. I always consider this to be one of my desert island records, if I was allowed like 10 records or so. This is one that I can still listen to today and still get something new out of it. You know, it's got this dark overtone that I've been mentioning throughout. I love the interplay between Rick and Roger's piano playing works. I friggin' love John's saxophone and clarinet playing on here. As I mentioned from the very top, he is the glue that ties everything together. Supertramp wouldn't be Supertramp without him. I would say it's a lightning in a bottle, but they would go on to do Crisis What Crisis and Even in the Quietest Moments afterwards, which are just as good. Yeah, that's all I've got to say about Crime of the Century. It's an absolute masterpiece. If you haven't heard it by now, what are you doing? Go out and listen to it. As I mentioned, it is the perfect crossover prog album. I wouldn't necessarily call this a capital P progressive rock album, but it is a rock band, a pop band from the 70s that are utilizing the progressive rock ideas that were coming around and playing around at that time to create just a perfect record. So there you go. There you go. What do you guys think about this record? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. And this is just the first of many albums within the classic rock or the classics albums of August. I will upload a new one every Tuesday and Thursday. So get ready for those. I'm super excited to share more of those with you. And I figured I'd kick everything off with this album. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed it and get excited for more. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.